Every day, the human habitat resembles more closely a cage.
Welcome to the Dreams of Consciousness podcast. If you'd be so kind, would you mind introducing yourself?
My name is Michael Korchonnoff, and I am the drummer, lead vocalist, and primary lyricist for Alda.
And how would you describe the music of Alda?
The music of Alda, well, first and foremost, the primary influence, I would say, is 90s European black metal, mostly Scandinavian black metal. But shot through with that is a myriad of influences from other kinds of music that we love. And music from bands like Agalloch, for example, and other bands that have blended, let's say, acoustic segments and acoustic music with theirs. The music of bands like Volley, the non-metal stuff that Oliver has done. The list goes on. So to say that we are a black metal band kind of like falls short of the complete truth.
And why is that? What does black metal mean to you?
Well, black metal describes a set of characteristics of sound and also aesthetic. And I think that the broader that a genre becomes, the less defined it becomes. So we could say that we are a black metal band, and there is some truth to that, but the volume of like what goes into the influences of our music, I think would make that definition limiting, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
It's the same for any genre, really. Any genre of music is going to have those limitations.
And would you say that your location in the Pacific Northwest also has a great deal to do with your sound?
Well, yeah. Yeah, I would say so. Not maybe in a way that, like, whether you could draw parallels between our sound and the sound of others who are also influenced very strongly by the same location. I don't know how clear those parallels could be, but the place that we live in and the music that we write about the place that we live in has a huge impact, for sure.
So I should mention that Alda have been on Dreams of Consciousness before. We did a Q&A back in 2015, I believe. But for anyone who hasn't read that or aren't familiar with the band, would you mind telling me a little bit about what brought you guys together and what led you to play the music that you make?
Well, we all met when we were going to high school together, actually, originally, in the town of Eatonville, which is, let's say, an hour or so outside of the city of Tahoma, which, to situate Tahoma geographically, it's in the greater Seattle metropolitan area, if you will. And Eatonville is a small mountain town, if you will, on the tourist route to what is known as Mount Rainier, which is also known as Mount Tacoma or Mount Tahoma to the indigenous people, the Chilean-speaking people of the region and the Puyallup people. So yeah, we grew up in the hills with that mountain right in our backyard, basically. And it's a small town with a small high school and not very many people into, at the time anyway, when we were youngsters, into metal or punk or what have you. And so Jason and I met and basically instantly became friends and bonded strongly when we were like 15 and 16 years old. And discovered this kind of music together, discovered Agalloch and Dark Throne and everything together. And that bond persisted past high school. And we weren't that far out of high school, and we'd been through a lot together as friends already when we formed Alda in 2007. And we had moved away from Eatonville at the time to the city of Tacoma, which is the closest metropolitan center, really. It makes sense if you grow up there, there ain't shit for work or anything. So if you're a kid growing up there, oftentimes you end up moving to Tacoma or the Seattle area generally just to find work and make a livelihood for yourself. So yeah, I think Jace was maybe 20. I was 21 at the time that we formed Alda, and we wanted to distill the influence, our musical influence from the past with our kind of the passions that were coming into us with our coming of age and the way that we were learning about the world and the things that we were feeling strongly about. And now 14 some years later, in a lot of ways, not much has changed. Like the passion, I think, is the same, and the influences are also the same, incidentally.
Not much has changed with the band's lineup as well, right? Like it's essentially the same group of people who you formed the band with in 2007. Is that right?
Yes, it is exactly the same. So I really only gave the background of Jason and I, but we were acquainted with Tim not super closely shortly before we formed Alda, because he was a bit younger than us, still to this day is a few years younger than us. But Jace was a friend of a family member of Tim's. And so that's how we knew Tim. And Tim, after we had moved out, and actually while Tim was still in high school, he was coming out to Tacoma to hang out and jam with us and all these things. And it organically led to the creation of the band. And Stephanie was a peer and a classmate of ours at the high school. And it was part of our friend group. And Jason and Stephanie became partners and are still partners and are now married. And so she, of course, naturally was there, like, and part of the thing from the beginning, and brought her own musical sensibilities and her interests and her passions to everything. So yeah, it has remained that same core group when we inaugurated ourselves under that name in the fall of 2007. It is the same people. The only thing that has changed as far as personnel goes is our live lineup. We have had other people fill in for Tim when he can't travel because he has limited availability for travel.
Now, how clear of an idea did you have in 2007 of what kind of music you wanted to make with Alda? I mean, you mentioned Agalloch and Dark Throne. I'm assuming that was a big part of your sound at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. So those were our influences then. Dark Throne, Agalloch, Ulver, huge one, Winder, huge one. Those are all still primary influences that we draw upon. But we either didn't have the mindset or maybe the musical ability to directly emulate our musical influences, if you will. So the music that we created more just had to do with what felt right to create. We would jam together, and we still create music to this day the same way, actually, where we jam pieces of things. Someone will maybe bring a riff that they have to the table. We'll layer things in, see how it feels, store it away for later, keep on building these pieces, and then see what comes together out of that. So I guess actually, to more directly answer your question, we did not have a clear idea of how we wanted to sound at all. We just knew what our influences were and the spirit of the music that we wanted to convey, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So without a clear idea of where you were headed, at least in those early years, when did you realize that the sound, when did you realize you were playing something that you guys were comfortable with, that you had a clearer idea of what you wanted Alda to be?
Every member of the band might have a slightly different answer to that question. So I hesitate to speak for everyone on that. But I think I'm going to say when we were writing the songs and performing the songs that would become part of Tahoma, I would say probably around there. Because everything before that more or less felt like we were still kind of finding our sea legs, We were experimenting with our abilities. We were pushing ourselves, but not quite arriving at a place where we felt, completely good about the songs that we were writing, I think. Now, not everybody is going to agree with that. Like maybe Jason and I might agree with that, and Tim might disagree, for example. But I think that's where it was for me anyway, was around that time. So that would have been like 2009 into the spring of 2010.
So as we move into a discussion about your latest album, are there still aspects of your sound that you feel are evolving, or things that from album to album do you guys feel the need to modify your sound or experiment with different elements?
Yeah. I think so. How intentional it is variable, I would say. Like that experimentation and that, there's that drive to push ourselves with everything that we create. But like with our songwriting, with the album, we don't really go into it ahead of time with a sort of mapped out concept of how, or a picture of how we exactly want it to sound. What happens is that picture emerges through the songwriting process. And then once we have a greater sense of the direction and, when we have like the meat of the songs and the skeleton of things in place, then we get into the details and start maybe pushing it more intentionally in a particular direction.
So let's talk about that songwriting process for a little bit. How do you guys arrange songs, and how does a song usually start?
The genesis of a song is with a riff that everybody likes. That's what it comes down to. We meet in the rehearsal space. We go through ideas that we have, or maybe even something just comes up spontaneously in the moment, while someone is noodling around on the guitar. It's pretty much either Jace or Tim is with something that they've written is where it starts. And then we will start playing. We might play a single riff for 20 minutes or something like that. It's just going over and over and over, the same repetition, seeing how it feels, trying different tempos, trying, different ascending speeds, like maybe both playing rhythm, maybe somebody noodling a lead over something. And then we see how that feels. We'll often record it on a field recorder or a phone or something. And then we'll see if anything that we remember from a previous session or a previous similar jam feels like it fits with that in a sequence. And if it doesn't, we'll set it aside, or maybe we'll just, try and riff off of that and see what grows. And we'll typically come up with a chunk of, let's say, riffs that will, form a portion of the song. That could be the beginning, could be the middle, could be the end. We don't know. And sometimes multiple songs will be in the process of being written, and we'll come back to these pieces, and some things we throw out and we're like, no, that isn't going anywhere, or we'll shelve it for later, which I will say that pretty much every album has other than maybe our very first album, every album has songs on it that are comprised of cast off elements from the previous album, if that makes sense. So we'll just work with that. And once we feel like we actually have a complete song that tells a particular story and has movements and an emotional momentum to it, and when that is complete, I will compose lyrics and give it a title. Sometimes it has a title before it has lyrics, and sometimes there are lyrics just to a particular portion of the song before it's complete, So that's, for the most part, that's how the songs are written. We maybe have a song or two that were intentionally, maybe let's say halfway or 2/3 structured off of these jam sessions and rehearsals by one person. And that's pretty much always Jace. Let's say, for example, the song Adrift on Tahoma and the song Drawn Astray on A Distant Fire on their newest album were both largely composed and structured by Jace. And so that's the furthest we go into the kind of single songwriter kind of influence of one particular person saying I have all these ideas of how these things will fit together. But what those pieces are come from multiple members, mostly Tim and Jace, but I write a riff here and there. Stephanie also contributes musically and will write pieces to songs. So that's kind of a meandering explanation of our process, but it's not that easy to describe.
I mean, aside from the songs that you mentioned that Jace largely wrote and arranged himself, it sounds like you guys write most of your music out of jams in the room together.
Yes, that is correct.
And would you say that your songwriting process has evolved with the time that you guys have spent with each other? I mean, at this point, it's about 14, 15 years, right, that you guys have been playing together?
Yeah. 14 and some change. Yeah. It totally has evolved. Yeah. With A Distant Fire in particular, I feel that it is worth mentioning that Tim took a much more active role in structuring and arranging the songs. Whereas in the past albums, like Tim, 50% of the riffs and melodies on our previous albums or more, sure, have been composed by Tim or collaboratively composed between Tim and Jace. But Tim maybe was feeling kind of a fire in his belly or like more in his element or whatever, but he like really stepped in and wanted to push for particular arrangements and particular tempos and particular ways of doing things. And I feel that has a strong influence in the way that A Distant Fire sounds. Some of the songs are like kind of faster and more aggressive. And I feel Tim's influence in that, which we were all really happy to see him step into that and feel comfortable doing that, And so that would be an example of growth. It's like all of the elements that were present for the previous, the songwriting for the previous albums, it was there for A Distant Fire with this added thing, this added ingredient, if you will. And that's part of that evolution.
So A Distant Fire is the name of your fourth album, and it'll be coming out on October 8th, which by the time people hear this podcast, the album will have been out for a few weeks. But let's talk about the writing of this album, because you guys have actually been working on this for a while, right?
Yeah. I would say so. In earnest, at least since late 2018.
And you described your songwriting process in some depth, and it does sound like it's fairly time intensive in the sense that there are several different people making contributions and being a part of the songwriting process. Is that more or less the reason why it's taken this long to come out?
That has that's a big part. That has a lot to do with it. To further put things in context, when our first self-titled album, Tahoma and Passage, were all written and recorded, through all of those albums, we were cohabitating together. Like, we lived in the same house, all four of us. So we, it was in living in a rural area. Like, if we wanted to schedule a rehearsal, we just had to like check in with each other. Basically, we had a lot of things going on respectively, and things that would take us this way or that. But at the end of the day, we all came back to the same place, ideally, or like every other week or whatever. And the albums were, not all of them, but Tahoma was recorded in a house that we lived in together, and Passage was also recorded in a different house that we all lived in together. So when we lost the house that we were living in, when we wrote and recorded Passage, because we were renting these places, renting houses with land, like did not own outright any of them, we ended up scattering. It was a situation where we couldn't and maybe didn't want to all live together at that moment. This was in 2016. And Jason, Steph, and Tim all went to different respective rural areas up in the hills in the vicinity of the big mountain of Tahoma. And I went to Olympia, the city of Olympia at the time. And so, some of us had half hour, 45, hour and a half commutes relatively to get to some garage, if you will, or some trailer, that a friend of ours out in the country had, and maybe rehearse. We had instability in our rehearsal space and also travel time that was added. So we finagle a way to get a rehearsal in, travel all this way, and then spend, let's say, maybe 6 hours in rehearsal and come up with 3 or 4 solid sections of things maybe that we're going to use, and some of which that we toss out. So that, given the pressures of life, Tim, has a family and kids and all that, and all the other things, it's totally time consuming. And it's time consuming specifically because of the way that we create our music and the way that it feels good to do that, and the necessity of all the people involved being there, and the dimension of being mostly rural living people like plays a big role as well. So yeah, those are all, that's all part of the reason it took so long. Also, with A Distant Fire in particular, it took us a couple of years, I would say, or a year and a half maybe, to get into a good rehearsal and writing schedule again. And when that happened, it was in the latter half, let's say like summer of, into the winter of 2018. And then from that point through the end of 2019, we were writing the songs for that album and very dedicated to that. And then we tracked everything, just about everything, with the exception of the acoustic parts and the vocals, I think, for A Distant Fire in February of 2020. So we tracked all of that, and then, the COVID pandemic hit and shit just got much more complicated. And we thought we were going to have everything done, ideally, on the schedule that we thought we were on. We thought we were going to have it all done in the summer of 2020, and it just didn't work out that way. So it added, a good year and a half basically got added on to our expected time schedule. Maybe not a year and a half, but more than a year. So I just, have to tack that on in the context of that onto the time, this extended time that is taken to complete this thing. But we're slow anyway for the reasons that I described before. So there's just no way to crank out albums like some bands do with the kind of lives that we live, How would you compare Distant Fire to your previous albums? What would you say makes this one different? It's faster. There's more riffs in it. I think some of the early influences that I described earlier kind of bleed through with a little more clarity. There's like more, when we listen to it, we hear more Darkthrone and more Windir in it than maybe we do with our previous albums, but we hear that influence and spirit in previous recordings that we did. And some of that just came out a little, it's like those influences are worn on our sleeve a little bit more on this one. And that wasn't even a super intentional thing. It just happened and then we noticed it.
So it wasn't writing a faster album or writing an album with more riffs wasn't necessarily your intention. When did you realize that the album had taken on those aspects, had gone in that direction?
I think it was when we wrote the song A Distant Fire that the album bears the name of, which we, wrote and named that song before we named the album. I believe we composed that song in, I think it was like December of 2018, November, December. There, I remember it was dark and wet when we were writing that. And when that was coming out, and for me in particular.
Isn't it kind of dark and wet a lot where you guys are?
Well, when you live there year round, dark and wet maybe means something a little different. You're like, sure, do an outside. I actually don't know where you're based. Or did you tell me? I can't remember. But
I'm based in Southeast Asia. It's wet a lot, not necessarily dark.
Oh, shit. Okay. Southeast Asia. Where in Southeast Asia are you?
Malaysia.
Malaysia. Okay. Wow. Cool. Very cool. Yeah. To us, like the winter months in the Pacific Northwest are very dark and very wet. And the rest of it is like darkish and gray and wet. And then the summer is hot and humid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, we were talking about when you guys realized the shape that the album was taking on.
Yeah, that's right. My memory is when A Distant Fire was written, because it was actually like parts of it were physically painful for us to rehearse, because we'd be playing that song or pieces of that song over and over and over again for hours, and the hands would be seizing up and we just have to like take 5 more often. And yeah, it was, I think especially when we were writing that song, we were like, wow, okay, this is going to be a little different, but this is what we feel like we need to do. The first song that was written out of the series of songs that are on the album was Stonebreaker, which we wrote earlier that year, but was built off of pieces of things that we had been rehearsing, I think close to a year before. Can't remember super well, but that song felt different too. But it was an isolated thing. We weren't sure, we didn't have a sense that we were like writing towards something yet, because there was all the aforementioned instability that was going on in our lives. And so when we were able to get together, we pulled together that song, and it was different in its own way. And we loved playing it. And we played it live a couple of times before anything else that is on the album had been written. But yeah, especially after A Distant Fire had been written, we had a sense that things altogether were going to be different in that particular way than it had been on our previous recordings.
Now, as the person who handles the vocals and writes the lyrics, do you want to say anything about the themes of the album?
Yeah. I guess I have a lot to say about it. So, well, first of all, before going further, I would like to describe a little bit what my process is for writing lyrics. And although I introduced myself as the primary lyricist, I am not writing from an isolated standpoint. I don't bring lyrics or ideas to the table and be like, here, this is what I wrote to the song. This is the way it goes. It is collaborative in the sense that we collectively discuss how the song is making us feel, what it brings up for us in our thoughts, like intellectually and emotionally. And we kind of agree loosely on a theme to begin with. And then from that starting point, I begin writing. And the song, A Distant Fire, is written from the perspective of somebody who is fleeing through a devastated, burned landscape at night. So they're trying to navigate a destroyed forest, if you will, a forest that has been destroyed by fire in darkness and not knowing exactly where they're going. And the only light that illuminates the path that they're following through this destroyed landscape is a glow that's on the horizon. But in the moment that they're following that path, it is unclear what the source of that glow is. That glow could be the very fire that destroyed the place that the wanderer is moving through, or it could be the sun coming up. It could be a distant dawn, or it could be both. It is unclear. And so that's kind of the metaphor that is in the narrative that is written into the song to articulate the feeling and the sense of being people experiencing ecological collapse, like massive ecological collapse. And it is a metaphor for not knowing exactly what the end point of this is, like experiencing an apocalypse, but whether that apocalypse is total in its annihilation, or whether it is a revolution in a sense that will produce a different world that that we can exist in is unclear. But all we have is to move towards that glow, because that's all we have to illuminate what we're experiencing. So that's the theme of the song that became the theme of the album, because as we were writing the songs, we realized that everything that we were writing and the way that we were feeling about what we were writing all leaned in to that same direction. So the lyrics to the songs of the album actually became a narrative that described the process of ascending a mountain, if you will, like going through this massive trial and this massive struggle that results in a brief moment of seeing the kind of like bigger picture from the peak, which is the song Forlorn Peaks, which represents that moment, and then dropping down into that unknown traverse, that unknown process of trying to traverse the devastation that you like have an awareness of, and that you've had moments of seeing the larger picture of, but you don't actually have the luxury of seeing all the time. So yeah, that's the direction that the lyrics lean in. That's ultimately why we named the album after that song as well. And why, part of the reason why the song A Distant Fire closes the album. The other reason is just this kind of like organic feeling way. It just turned into this big epic thing. And we were like, well, there's, what the hell is going to come after this, So it fell into the role of being the last song on the album.
Now, with this lyrical thread running through the entire album, would you describe A Distant Fire as a concept album?
Sure. Yeah, you could call it that. I'm not going to introduce it as that, though. It came together so haphazardly that it just doesn't, it would feel disingenuous to call it that, to be honest. It just kind of exists as that, But it definitely wasn't written as a concept album. But it came into being as one.
I mean, during the period that you guys were working on this album, there were a number of fires running through the West Coast, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, every year there is, and it gets worse every year.
Do you want to say anything about that?
Well,
you don't have to. I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
My thoughts are that
I mean, we have regular forest fires here in Southeast Asia that manifest where I live mostly as thick clouds of smoke that darken our skies. But I never have to. It hasn't gotten to the point where like I'd have to evacuate where I live, So to that extent, it's part of life here, but also not a life-threatening part of life, right? At least not immediately. Whereas I think throughout the Pacific Northwest and Northern California, I think it's very much a cause for concern in terms of your town might go up in flames. Yeah.
Now, for where most of the band of Alda live at the moment, it is not yet to that concern. This is something we see on the horizon creeping up, if you will. So it gets worse and worse on Northern California, coming up through Oregon. It was particularly bad in Oregon last year. And the fires raged all the way up to Portland, which is like a 4-hour drive south of where Jason, Stephanie, and Tim live, really. So with the increasing dryness that comes with the increasing heat of climate change and the decreasing water, it just like becomes this thing that's coming closer and closer. Now, I actually live in Southern Oregon. I'm like, at the moment, I live like 2 hours away from the California redwoods. I'm like an hour and a half drive away from the California border, maybe. I'm in the Siskiyou Mountains. It's kind of like the bottom tip of the Cascadian region, if you will, the southernmost tip. That's a debatable point. Some people would disagree with me, but at the moment where I am in the Siskiyous, you go too much further south, you're in the political boundaries of Oregon, but it looks like California when you get down to, let's say, like the Ashland area, city of Ashland, which is the southernmost city on the I-5 highway corridor. So yeah, I was here last year when the fires were happening, and I had my vehicle packed up, ready to evacuate. Saw that, did support work for people who had lost their homes, and also homeless people who had lost their tents, their homes, if you will, from fires and in parks, doing aid, and have lived for months in just like thick black smoke that is a combination of both the burned landscape and hundreds of structure fires in the area. So that's something, at least in the life that I've been living, I've experienced directly firsthand in my living situation a little more than the other members of the band, but we all have a sense of the impact, and it's really impacted Jace because he's really a lifestyle hunter who goes out into the wilderness for weeks at a time, really, and travels around and goes to Eastern Washington and saw this year areas that he really cherished and loved and had been visiting for a decade or so burned, and witnessed that devastation firsthand. So yeah, there's the more metaphorical element of the album lyrics and the album concept and all that, and then there's the very directly blunt literal aspects of it as well.
Tell me a little bit more about the recording of this album and who you guys ended up going with.
A Distant Fire was recorded by Jake Superchi, who plays in the band Uada. And so how that came about with him recording us it's kind of a long story. We've been acquainted with Jake for many years. We used to go watch his pre-Uada band, which was called Ceremonial Castings, play 15 years ago. 16 years ago, Jason and I would go see Ceremonial Castings. Alda played a few shows with Ceremonial Castings in our earlier days. When Uada first started up and was first playing shows, I think before maybe they recorded their first album, we played some of those early shows with them in Olympia. They'd come and stay at the land that we lived on at the time. This was around the time that we recorded Passage. So, there's people we knew. They're a bit older than us, been doing this for a lot longer than we have. And, people, there's mutual respect, and that kind of transformed into more of a friendship when we toured in Europe in 2018. And as fate would have it, Uada and Alda, two bands from basically the same region with similar sounding names and 4 letters in their names, ended up touring together in Europe because we were on the same label with Eisenwald. We were working with the same label. So we got to spend a lot more time around each other and see each other play live. And, we'd always been on good terms with Jake, but we hit it off with them on a personal level, much more so then. And it was on that same tour, which the person who runs Eisenwald was traveling basically as Uada's tour manager on that tour. And so we had not met him in person either. He had his hands in the release of Passage. We'd emailed back and forth with him many, many, many times over some years. And then we got to spend some time with him in person and with Jake in person all together. And the subject had come up in conversation at one of the shows. It might have been Paris or somewhere in the UK. I can't remember exactly, about the possibility of recording another Alda album. And Eisenwald were emphatic about their support for that idea. And sometime shortly after the tour, I think it was, I don't remember exactly when it was, but Jake reached out to us and expressed his interest in recording us if we wanted to do another album, and if we wanted to take him on, because he was wanting to venture into that. He basically had just had experience recording his own projects at that time. But he was saying, I like your guys' music. I like where you come from. I respect what you do for a long time. We're on the same label. And Nico's giving financial support basically to record the next Uada album. I could lump those sessions and those resources in with the Alda album and do them at the same time, basically, which is what ended up happening. So it was Uada's Jin, that album Jin, and A Distant Fire were kind of wrapped up together, kind of back to back for Jake. Anyway, he tracked most of Jin and then went straight into tracking A Distant Fire while he was still mixing Jin, was the process. So there were some challenging elements to recording with Jake, because he had a very particular way of doing things that worked really well for his music. And I don't know how much of the technical details I really feel like getting into, because I feel like I could ramble on for a while about it. But basically, we had to kind of find a balance between our perspectives, because we realized when we met up that we had pretty dramatically different approaches to recording and what we felt comfortable with. And, but we found a happy medium, and Jake was super patient with us and extremely adaptable, actually, which is really kind of incredible reflecting on it, considering that he hadn't recorded anyone else. I could have seen him just kind of either digging in his heels about what felt right for him to do, or throwing in the towel, but he didn't. He was just okay, that's the way you guys want to do it. That's how we're going to do it. The one thing he really did put his foot down on was mixing it in his own space, and he didn't want anybody present for the mixing. which is something we were accustomed to doing with our friend Nate Myers, who recorded Passage and Tahoma. We were there for mixing sessions for everything. So it felt like it streamlined the process, but Jake really wanted to do everything himself in his own space and on his own time. So when it came to the mixing, he would send us mixes and we would just create these long lists of changes. And it was back and forth for months and months, getting everything sounding, I guess, as close as the way we wanted it to sound and within reason with what Jake had the time and ability to do. And yeah, that's it in a nutshell. The tracking, much of the tracking happened in Olympia at a space called Onera, which is the rehearsal and recording space that Fauna uses, the band Fauna. And it's the people from Fauna and Johnny DeLacy in particular, like old close friends with us. Johnny toured with us in Europe, filling in for Tim, and was super happy and generous to lend us the space to record in. So that's where the drums were tracked, and some of the guitars and other of the guitars were actually tracked up in Eatonville, like real close to where we live, in our rehearsal space that we had at the time. And then vocals and the acoustic tracks were then done in Onera again a little bit later. So when the pandemic, I guess, had like kicked off and the lockdowns were still happening. So it was like April or May, I think, when we did the vocals and acoustic instruments.
Now, did that affect the tracking at all? Or were you guys mostly done by that point?
By the point that the pandemic?
That you were recording the vocals? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, the drums, guitars, bass, yeah, pretty much everything. It was just the finishing touches at that point. The vocals were done at the very end. And that's where when things were getting hard to navigate. Spaces and whatnot, what people felt comfortable hosting in their space, this and that, kind of characteristic things that have come with the COVID-19 pandemic. So in that sense, and this is a thing I think about sometimes, like if Jake hadn't offered to record us and hadn't been like so flexible with his time, because it's what he does, he does, and to my knowledge, he doesn't have another job that he does. He is completely 100% around the clock dedicated musician, So anytime that we were available, he would like drive up from Battleground, which is the town that he lives in, and would sleep on the floor of wherever and bring all of his recording gear, and was down to be up at any point in the night, So his like the ultimate availability and flexibility is what enabled it to be finished in the time that it was, I guess, or the tracking at least, because if we had to like book studio time, maybe, in a different kind of situation, maybe things would have worked out with, but it felt fortuitous in a way, because it felt like we basically squeaked in all the heavy stuff before things got really weird. So I felt super grateful for that, honestly.
So the album was mastered by Mel Detmer? How do you pronounce this? Detmer, yeah. Mm-hmm. Who's worked with Sun and Earth. How did she get involved with this recording?
Mel mastered Tahoma and Passage also. And how this came about, and Mel has worked with a lot of like great albums and has a great studio and all this, and is a real professional. Like she's, a real professional at what she does. And I think it was back in 2010, after we recorded Tahoma, we, on the advice of Nate Myers, we sought out a good professional mastering job. And I wasn't sure who to talk to. So I reached out to my friend Chet W. Scott, who does the band Blood of the Black Owl, and Cycle of the Raven Talons, has a label called Glass Throat Recordings, local dark music, like intense person who I respect a lot and still do, and creates incredible work. And I had reached out to him and asked for advice for who to have things mastered with. And he directed me to Mel, who does all of his stuff, or did at the time anyway, presumably still does. So I got in contact with Mel, sent Mel our album. Mel was happy to do it, gave us like a real good price on it, like considering the the caliber of the work that she does. And yeah, mastered Tahoma, and it made a huge impact on the album. So we just kind of kept coming back to her like year after year. And that's the story with Mel Dittmer mastering A Distant Fire, is that she's done her other stuff, and she's done the mastering for albums created by other projects that I'm in as well.
And what would you say Jake and Mel brought to your sound?
Mel does the thing that she always does, gives it her particular touch. She like brings a kind of like warmness to the sound, I would say. I'm not real educated on the ins and outs of the mastering process, so it comes off as a little mysterious to me, but I can hear the effect when it's done, if that makes sense. And what Jake brought to our sound, yeah, he gave it a kind of like clarity and a robustness, I think, that differs from our previous albums, and gave it a kind of, if you will, like a cold touch, like much more of a, Jake is a guy who's like very steeped in metal and black metal, and has been for since we were kids, basically. He's been doing that. So there's some of his sound, his sensibility, while also leaning towards what he hears in our sound and what we like to hear. We really like the space and, the atmosphere in a way, in a particular, putting reverb on things and this and that. But yeah, Jake brought a kind of like clarity and heaviness and also rawness to it that we appreciate. And yeah, it's a heavy sounding album in parts. He really worked hard on it.
So by the time people hear this, A Distant Fire will be out through Eisenwald Records. Michael?
Yes.
What's the best way to get this album? How can people order it?
Well, the best way to order it is going to be through Eisenwald's website. I don't have the URL handy at the moment, but you can easily look it up on any search engine. And when you go to the front page of Eisenwald, they're going to have like two options for North American folks and the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, basically. So through the Alda Bandcamp pages, you can download it and probably buy the albums as well. We might go back to doing direct mail order through ourselves, through the band, with copies that we get from the label. And we're also like wanting to do shirts again and other things of that nature. And we have a small supply of things left over from the past, old LPs and CDs and other things and whatnot. So we'll announce that on our Facebook and Instagram page when that happens.
Now, do you want to say anything about the physical releases that are coming out?
Yeah. The physical releases have some cool art that we commissioned that's part of the overall story. And that art was created by a friend of ours named Craig Strother, who's an old Alda fan who Jace got in contact with. Can't remember exactly how or why, but he moved to the Pacific Northwest a few years ago and got in touch with us, and Jace commissioned him to do the art, both the cover and the interior paintings. So with the CD and the LP release of the album, there is a set of paintings on the inside booklet for a set of 4 paintings that Craig Strother created, which depict a single location going through a fire cycle. So before the fire, during the fire, immediately after the fire, and then sometime after the fire, with new life emerging out of the ashes of that fire. So for the bleakness that is implied by the cover art, with the memento mori motif, the skeleton of the man going up the hill, of the person going up the mountain and failing in the process of trying to complete this Herculean task. There is also kind of a more cyclical, revolutionary, and maybe like positive in a way depiction that's on the inside. And those are 2 aspects of the fire metaphor, if you will, in the album. And we have some other art that's on the actual disc that was made by our old friend, Kevin Alexanderwicz, who has done t-shirt designs and also did the interior illustrations on the Passage album. And Yeah. So there's great art on the inside with a lot of thought and care put into it by friends of ours, following our vision and helping us realize our vision for those who care to hold a physical object, a physical artifact of the music in their hands.
Now, is Eisenwald one of these labels that does like limited edition vinyl versions and stuff?
I think so. Yeah, I don't know for sure what their plans are with I'd have to go back and look at the emails. I do know that the vinyl has been delayed because of problems with the pressing plants. Just, it's just the supply chain being impacted by the chaos of the last couple of years. And so no pre-order has gone up for the LP because it's been impossible for the label to get like an ETA. Like the order's in and has been in for like 6 months or something like that. But there's still, I guess, no idea exactly when they're coming in. So we decided to, because it was very important for us, the band, that the album came out this year. And Eisenwald agreed that it didn't make sense to push off the whole thing just so that the LP could be released around the same time. So I think there probably will be a limited edition one of like black or something, but I can't remember off the top of my head at the moment, to be honest. These are not the kinds of things I track super closely. I'm in conversation about it, but it's limited edition that, limited edition this, I don't know. It's important to me that the music ends up in people's hands, But beside that, it's kind of like, I guess, whatever the people who are paying for the records themselves to be produced decide they want to do with that, so long as like it's not super exploitive or indulgent, they can do what they want with it.
And if people want to get updates on, when the vinyl is coming out, as well as other news about Alda, what's the best way to follow you guys online?
Facebook and Instagram. Right now, look up Alda Cascadia, one word, for Instagram, and then I believe it's the same on Facebook. And Jason and I run those social media accounts, and we periodically post news updates about what's happening. And definitely right now, we're trying to stay on top of it. We don't use social media a whole lot. We're like behind that game as a lot of folks, we just try to keep it pertinent to what's actually going on. So as a result, there's kind of like dry spells in information. But if anyone like gets in there and actually like looks at our feed of what we posted, the information is going to be in there. And there hopefully is not going to be like a big chunk of bullshit in there in between, like an announcement about the album or whatever. So yeah, it shouldn't be that hard to find out. But if you follow those social media accounts, you will hear us talk about it.
Is there anything else you want to say?
I don't know. Take care of each other. These are hard times and they're not going to get easier.
Well said. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, Adrian.